To support our discussions with the world's leading thinkers, please see the video description or visit eism.eu/support. Thank you.
Hello and welcome. Before I introduce today's guest, allow me to make a couple of preliminary comments about what makes today's interview unique and why I think it's worth your time. As the title of the video suggests, we're going to talk about what makes a good and clear theory of the world. To come up with a good fundamental theory of the world, one has to either begin or end with the foundations of physics, precisely because we live in a physical universe. Anybody who wants to build a fundamental theory of the world, even if their philosophy or theology or mathematics takes them to many other imaginary worlds, must ultimately return to this world, the one in which human beings actually live. This is precisely where the clear and unambiguous thinking of today's guest stands out. He keeps things grounded. You'll see, however, that a key question emerges. In a world full of so many viable physical theories, how do we pick the right one? That might be the single most pressing question in all of physics and philosophy. And explicitly bringing it to the fore is what makes this conversation and this channel unique. This is especially true on an increasingly polarized planet that's full of nuclear weapons. I'm happy to say that Maudlin and I agree about many things, including the need for clarity and the revolutionary significance of theoretical physicist Yakir Aharanov. In fact, stand by for a follow-up conversation about the Aharnov-Bohm effect, which is one of the most uncelebrated but important effects in quantum mechanics, and how it's connected to Maudlin's new theory of the world and to long-term human survival. If this sounds far-fetched, keep in mind that what's on offer here is a scientific and empirical claim, not a philosophy or opinion. As always, you'll find a timestamp and several relevant links in the video description. Please let me know what you think, and thank you for your continued support. Hello and welcome to A Theory of Everything. I'm Luis Razo, the Executive Director of the European Institute of Science and Management and host of this channel. Today we have the pleasure of talking once again to Dr. Tim Maudlin, a prominent professor of philosophy and physics at New York University. He's made significant contributions to the philosophy of space and time, to the interpretation of quantum mechanics, and to a rising discipline, I think we can refer to it as a discipline, known as the foundations of physics. As most of our listeners already know, Professor Maudlin is highly regarded for his clear and rigorous philosophical thinking. In fact, his clarity of thought had made him a really respected figure in the academic community, not only in the academic community, but basically online. He's very well admired, and also a force to be reckoned with in the philosophy of science. Professor Maudlin, welcome, and thanks for taking the time to talk again.
Thanks for the ridiculously nice introduction.
Well, I saw that you had a bit of a run-in with Bernardo-Kastrup on Kurt Mongel's podcast. So without wanting to stir things up unnecessarily, I actually think that confrontation is quite relevant for our conversation today. So can we start there? And can you tell us what first of all, who Bernardo is and what happened from your perspective?
I can tell you what I know, although I'm not at all an expert on Kastrup. In fact, the only way I got involved in this was that Kurt Mongel asked me if I'd be willing to, come on together with him. I really didn't know his work. A little bit of looking around, as far as I can tell, he's some kind of idealist, or is arguing for some kind of idealism, which classical idealism is the idea, is the thesis that all that really exists are minds and their contents, like Berkeley held, or in a way Leibniz held. And with the weird twist that somehow results from physics could support this thesis, which, I mean, just offhand, you say that really doesn't make a whole lot of sense, because when you go and do an experiment in physics, like one of these tests of Bell's inequalities, the sort of things that the Nobel Prize was given for a couple of years ago, of course, it's a fundamental assumption that there is a physical world that exists outside your mind. There are material objects like magnets and so on, and particle detectors and so on in your lab that exist outside of your minds. And you're setting up a certain physical situation and watching to see how it will come out, to use those results as evidence for or against a physical theory, which postulates that there's a physical world that exists outside your mind. So, it's sort of from the get-go, you say, no, physical results, as it were, could not cast doubt on the existence of a physical world. And that was more or less, I had a list of questions that were going to be asked, much more specific things about non-locality and Bell's inequality and so on. But anybody, and I was willing to sit there and talk however long, but anybody who watched that, here's the fact. Kastrup went first, and I sat there quietly and listened to what he had to say. And the last thing was, again, this idea that somehow these experimental results could cast doubt on physical reality. And I started out saying, well, that's silly for the reasons I just was about to give. And then he jumped in, and the whole thing got very heated. And then he stomped off. Okay, what can I do? That's the extent of it. I'm certainly no expert at all on what he's arguing. I just got the impression from looking around a little that he was trying to argue for this idealist position, somehow from trying to cite results from physics. And again, it just, as a simple logical observation, that just doesn't make any sense. So that's all I have. If you want to tell me more about him, I can listen, but I can't offer any informed opinions about the more detailed views that he holds, because that was the only encounter I've ever had with him, and I've never sat down and read anything by him.
No, I think you've described his ideas correctly. In a summary, he's an idealist, and he basically argues that there is no physical reality. And I agree with you, although in my interaction with him, I was a little bit more politic. I didn't refer to his ideas as silly, but I think it is rather silly to think that to say that there's no physical reality. However, I will say this, that I found it, I'm not sure what word to use, but he, like you said, he began by saying that recent experiments demonstrate that physical reality is wrong. It has been disproven. And he said, unless one is willing to adopt grotesque theories about the nature of reality. And if you're going to use this kinds of language, it's very insulting, no, to somebody who actually feels different than you do. So
yeah, that's what I was reacting to, was that comment at the end, is grotesque theoretical fantasies or something. Because I said, look, there are perfectly well-defined physical theories that make no mention of minds or anything else that predict the outcomes of these results. That's why we could predict the outcomes of those experiments before they were done. Now, he may not like those theories for whatever reason. Maybe you should sit down and think why they have, and indeed must have, some kind of counterintuitive posits in them. That's the whole point of doing the experiments. Just to take it off this topic a little, the same thing happens. Sometimes people say, well, there's this simulation hypothesis that we just live in a computer simulation, blah, blah, blah. And then they say, oh, and maybe some experimental or observational evidence of this. And then you stop and think, well, what in the world can you mean by that? And usually what they have in mind is, well, here's what our computers can do. And so if we're in a simulation, I guess those computers would have the same limitations as ours have. And then there would be some limit to how well it could simulate. But if you stop a minute and you think, wait a minute, if your theory is correct and we live in a simulation, then the physics we believe is simulated physics. It's whatever physics they programmed into their machines. That's all we would have access to. We would have no access whatever to the actual physics that runs the machines. So just the logical structure of this doesn't make any sense, right? You're suggesting that what we take to be outcomes of laboratory experiments can have consequences that they just can't have because of the logical structure of the argument. Let me see.
Well, very good. Well,
turn that off.
Well,
that's a bit better. Sorry.
No problem. I don't know if it makes you feel any better about the him stomping off, but in my interaction with him, I read his book and asked him for an interview. He agreed. I told him that I would have some differences, and then we got to the day of the interview, and I let him know in advance because I don't like to surprise anybody. And he said he didn't want to talk about it and just stomped off.
Well,
and I thought that was very odd. Yeah.
Yeah, that somehow doesn't surprise me much given what happened in this case.
Sure.
Somehow or other, someone posted something that, he had put up some thing on the web about this interview and about how, oh, what did I think was silly? Did I think this was silly or that was silly? And the simple answer is, if you hadn't interrupted me, I would have said exactly what I thought was silly, right? So there's this very strange thing of I can't imagine what he's objecting to when you don't even allow me to finish my statement. After I sat there, and anybody can go look at the thing, I just sat there and listened to him while he gave his statement. I didn't interrupt him or anything. So if someone's going to behave that way, they're going to behave that way. And anybody can judge from the record who's behaving in what way. So I don't know what else to say.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I wrote to him after and I told him he's always welcome to come back and talk about it. But I basically confronted him with things that are blatantly contradicted by some very prominent scientists and empirical evidence. So I asked him to explain what he means if he's trying to go up against these empirical findings and to explain his ideas. And he said he wasn't. He just stomped off. In any case, why I think it's worth bringing this up as an introduction to our talk, because we agreed to talk about a couple of things, and I'm very much looking forward to that. But I think it's worthwhile as an introduction because it demonstrates a very widespread phenomenon about the interpretations at the foundations of physics. So can we start there? What do you think about so many different interpretations, and how does one finally settle for the right interpretation? In fact, in a couple of your lectures, you take this up, and I think they're relevant and important ideas. So would you mind talking to us about this?
Sure. Quantum phenomena, by which there are a lot of them that are discussed, just the simple two-slit experiment, violations of Bell's inequality. Other things one could talk about, but again, phenomena
the Aharnov-Bohm effect as well.
The Aharnov-Bohm effect, absolutely, which I think doesn't get nearly enough attention.
I agree.
You kind of have to start again by saying, well, look, this is just stuff we see in the lab, right? This is ground zero. If you're willing to go far enough to say, no, that's just a simulation, or you're plugged in the matrix, or you're a disembodied mind that's being fooled by an evil demon, then you're never going to get anywhere, right? So kind of ground zero of just doing physics is that there are some laboratory outcomes that you take as given. Then you try and explain them, right? You then think, okay, here's the behavior. What does the behavior tell me about the physical world that's producing that behavior? Now, when I say tell me, typically it's not some unique, univocal result that follows. Rather, you're just trying to come up with theories that would make these predictions. And there might be different ways to do it. And once you have at least one, but then maybe a couple different theories that can pass the test of making the right predictions, then you get into a very hard question of, can I really distinguish between them and say there's good reason to believe one over another? And there may not be. I mean, you shouldn't go into it expecting that every question you have is going to have the rationally preferable answer. You just might end up in a situation where you say, well, we've got various proposals on the table, and as far as the experiments go, they're all okay. And we just aren't in a position to make a good judgment among them. But what do we want these proposals to have? There are some features we know from the beginning we want them to have. We want them to be clearly stated in unambiguous and sharp terms. And part of the problem with quantum mechanics, which is quite unique to it, was that when it started out, it didn't have that form because of the mention of measurement, because in the usual expositions of the theory, it said, well, when you don't measure a system, it does this. And then when you measure it, it does something quite different. That's kind of baked into the standard approach as codified by von Neumann. And that gives rise to what's typically called the measurement problem, which is the problem is that the term measurement just isn't clear. It's not clear what counts as a measurement. There are all kinds of interactions you can have with a system. But if to apply physics, I have to divide those interactions in a sharp way into the measurements and the other things, nobody knows how to do it. This was a complaint that Einstein had early on when he said, when they talked about measurements as making observations that would collapse the wave function. And he said, well, can a mouse do it? Right? This amazing thing. Einstein had this all the time. He says, well, I just can't believe that when I close the door to my bedroom, my bed starts to kind of dissipate and become not well located. But when I open the door and look again, it suddenly snaps back into place because I'm an observer and all of a sudden I collapse its wave function. He said, I just can't believe that. And John Bell said the same thing. You say the wave function of the universe happily evolved by Schrodinger evolution for billions of years until the first measurement. Well, when was that? When the first single-celled organism developed, or did it take a fancier organism with a PhD to make a measurement? I mean, these are observations that the very conceptual basis that's being appealed to in stating the physics is the wrong kind of thing. And so I think it's perfectly fair to say physics shouldn't be like that. So there's a term that's used. There were a series of conferences called Quantum Mechanics Without the Observer. And the title was given because you don't want the statement of quantum mechanics to depend upon or make reference to observers or observations or measurements. Bell also said nicely, he wants a theory that neither requires nor is embarrassed by the presence of an observer, right? Observers and measurements and observations should just be physical systems that are interacting with other physical systems in accordance with the usual laws of physics, and the laws of physics don't care whether it's an observer or a measurement. And so that's a kind of just intrinsic standard of precision and clarity that one would like out of a physical theory. Now, it turns out that you can meet that standard. You can come up with clear, sharp accounts of these physical effects with theories that don't mention measurement, that don't have any vagueness, where the physics is all in some clearly defined mathematical equations, dynamical equations, and so on. And so those are the sorts of serious theories one ought to think about. Whether among those theories you can really decide which is the most plausible, that's an open question. It depends on what evidence you have. It depends on all kinds of things, and you can't predict beforehand what the situation will be. So I think of my job as to articulate the theories we have in hand that can meet this standard and how they work, and the challenges that face them as you try to expand them beyond, say, usually they're presented in a non-relativistic way, so you want a kind of relativistic version. You have problems at high energies. There are all kinds of things that can happen. But that's the way I think about it, if that addresses your question.
If I've understood correctly. So in interpretations of physics, well, let me take us one step back further. Richard Feynman, in his Messenger lectures, talks about interpretation in physics. And sometimes non-physicists, and apparently even some physicists, forget the fact that physics can be and should be interpreted in many different, for example, mathematical formalisms. You can look at a phenomenon and interpret it and understand it, and even make predictions with different mathematical formalisms. So what Feynman says is that any good physicist keeps as many of these interpretations or formalisms in his or her mind, because we never know where the next breakthrough may come from.
So let me address that, because that's mixing together in my mind two different issues. I generally don't like the word interpretation. I don't think the word interpretation helps, especially if you say I'm interpreting a theory, because then you say, well, I've got the theory and somehow now I'm adding to that an interpretation. The way I would put it is this: you have some physical phenomena, fine. What you now want is a theory that will predict it. Now, that theory is not an interpretation in the normal sense. It's really, a freely invented posit, as Einstein pointed out. He said there's an element when you do theorizing that you just freely come up with some idea. So you have alternative theories that make different claims about the physical world. You first want to check, do they actually make these predictions? Do they predict what we see? Those are not different. That's what often people call different interpretations of quantum mechanics, are really just different theories. Now, given a single theory, there's a second point, which is, I think, what Feynman had in mind. A single theory, say Newtonian mechanics, can be presented in different mathematical languages or different mathematical garbs, if you will. So you can talk about F equals ma, or you can talk about a fundamental Hamiltonian, or you can talk about the principle of least action. And often these are provably mathematically identical. They're just sort of different mathematical ways to present the same fundamental dynamics. And if we knew that that was the final theory, you would say, okay, these are just, take your pick. If you're more comfortable calculating using this one than that one, it's a free world. But I think Feynman's point, which I quite agree with, is that we're not done with physics. We know there's more physics to be done. And what we need to do is take the theories that pretty well work, but we know aren't finished, aren't complete, and think about how to extend them. And stating the theory you've got in hand in many different mathematical languages suggests different ways to extend it, suggests different new theories, right? Successor theories. And it's very wise to have as many of these as possible in your head, because they, as it were, naturally suggest different modifications that you might make. So I think his suggestion there is quite correct. I again wouldn't really call those different interpretations. I would just say they're different mathematical presentations. So we have two different issues. When do we have different theories, like a collapse theory, right? In quantum mechanics, an objective collapse theory is just a different theory than a theory that says the wave function never collapses. In that case, it's easy to see because in principle, they even make different predictions, although often it's hard to do the experiments that would show it. So there, I don't want to call them different interpretations of the same theory because they're just different theories. Then you have different mathematical presentations of the same theory. I wouldn't call those different interpretations either. I just call them different mathematical presentations and say with Feynman that the virtue of thinking up new mathematical ways of presenting one and the same theory is that it might make suggestions about how to alter the theory in order to extend it in the way we know it needs to be extended. This happens, often people say, well, how do we quantize general relativity? And then one answer is, well, first of all, which is not the way it's usually presented, reframe standard general relativity in Hamiltonian form. That's not the way you learn it. And you say, well, why should I do that? And the answer is, well, once it's in Hamiltonian form, there are standard quantization procedures I can apply to it, right? And then I do that, and then I see what happens. Now, what happens is I get the Wheeler-DeWitt equation, which raises a whole bunch of weird issues because it seems to suggest nothing changes. And you might say that's a pretty bad outcome to end up with a theory that says nothing changes. Whether there are ways around that and so on. I mean, now you know what the challenge is. But that took two steps. Take standard general relativity, which is presented using Einstein's field equations, rewrite it in a Hamiltonian way, apply the quantization procedure to the rewritten theory, and then see what pops out the other end. That's more or less how Wheeler and DeWitt came up with the theory. So, but none of those, I think the word interpretation is just not the right word there.
Okay, so a couple of questions. First of all, it's one that Feynman uses directly, and but let's not haggle over words. Maybe we can shed light on this if we, or if you help us understand what's the difference or what's the right word to use to compare the many worlds versus the Bohmian picture.
Those are different theories. Those are obviously different theories because the Bohmian theory, take the Bohmian particle theory. Its fundamental physical posit is that there are point particles, usually point particles, in a four-dimensional space-time that move around. They have, at any given moment, precise configurations. The configuration changes as the particles move around in this space. That's the fundamental posit. Without that, you don't understand the theory at all. And Everett doesn't posit that. Just does. If you ask an Everettian, are there point particles moving around? They will say no, absolutely not. I mean, the way in the normal terminology, Everett is an attempt to have a theory in which the wave function of the universe is complete. All of the physical facts about the universe are somehow coded up in its wave function. And the pilot wave interpretation is one where the wave function is not complete. In addition to the wave function, in addition to the quantum state, there are particles or fields, or you could do it in different ways. But that's why it's called a, quote, hidden variables theory. Again, Bell says that's a silly name for it, because if the additional variables were hidden, they wouldn't do you any good. You know, if you couldn't see them, then they couldn't be playing a role in explaining what you do see. So he says, call them additional variables theories, which is quite right. The pilot wave theory has, in addition to the quantum state, which Everett has, these particles or these fields. That's why it's not a many worlds theory, because there's only one set of particles and they don't split and they don't divide. And, you know, the particles in the cat at the end of the day, either end up in a live cat configuration or in a dead cat configuration, but not both. So it's not a many worlds theory, and it's clearly a different physical theory. So those are that's why I want to say, don't call those two interpretations of the same thing. Now, they give you different accounts of what happens in an experiment like the Schrodinger cat experiment. According to the Everett interpretation, or according to the Everett, now I'm using it, according to Everettianism, you start out with one cat and you end up with an infinite number of cats, one of which is alive and a bunch of which are dead, but dead in different ways because the poison would have been emitted at different times. And so the way the cat dies would be slightly different. So, that's a fundamental result, as it were, of taking an Everettian approach. In the pilot wave approach, you start out with one cat and you end up with one cat. I mean, in the entire universe, there's only one cat. And that cat is either alive or it died at some time. And all of that information would be contained in what the particles did, how the particles behave. So these are just vastly different accounts of the physical universe. And so if you say they're just two different interpretations of the same theory, you're not understanding how radically different they are, right? That's why I don't like that language. On the other hand, if I take standard Newtonian mechanics and then write it in Lagrangian form or write it in Hamiltonian form or something, it does seem the right thing to say is you haven't changed the theory at all. You just have one theory, you're just presenting it in different mathematical guises. That's quite a different thing. There's even a little bit of dispute about that, but that's a very subtle dispute. Normally, a physicist would say those are just different mathematical presentations of one and the same theory.
Okay, so what word would you use to refer to the way Einstein first came up with the ideas that led up to relativity for special and general relativity, or the ideas that Feynman in his lectures talks about a Mayan thinker, a young thinker who approaches the priestly class in his civilization and says, maybe there are rocks up in the sky, and they ask him, well, how much can you calculate, or how accurate are your calculations? Well, I haven't done them yet. Well, and Feynman says, well, then get out of here. We don't want your theory. And Feynman characterizes this as a bad approach. So that phenomenon of thinking of something at a very high level to try to make progress in science and in theories, what's the right word to use in that case?
Well, let me, since we have a lot of time, I hope you don't mind if I
No, absolutely. Please
launch
do.
into a little explanation here. When we think about special relativity, it's many people have mistaken ideas both about what Einstein was worried about when he came up with the theory. And then the real subtleties about what you even mean by the theory as Einstein originally understood it. So a common misconception is that Einstein I talked about, you have to start with something in the lab or something you see, right? You have to start with some physical phenomenon if you're going to do physical theorizing, of course. There's a common misconception that what Einstein was really worried about was the result of the Michelson-Morley experiment, which was looking for evidence that light travels at different speeds in different directions relative to the surface of the Earth, which would have been implied by a certain theory of ether theory of light. The actual fact is that it's not even clear Einstein knew about that experiment. There's no mention of it in the 1905 paper. There's a little bit of a vague and sort of offhand mention of some experiments. He could have been talking about other experiments having to do with light and water, and it's not clear that it was Michelson and Morley. What he does talk about at the beginning of that paper, the thing that bugged him about Maxwellian electrodynamics, and he's very clear about it, and this will illustrate what one means by a physical theory is he says, well, let's take a simple case where I've got a loop of wire attached to an ammeter, so it's going to measure current. And I have a magnet. And what you can just check is that if you take the magnet and run it through the loop, current runs in the wire, right? The needle on the ammeter moves. So that's electromagnetic induction, right? That's how that's basically how we make AC current. We take if you have a hydroelectric dam, you take a magnet and get the water coming down to spin the magnet and then put it in the middle of one of these loops, and you get a changing magnetic field that induces a changing electric field. Okay, now Einstein says, but here's something very strange he found very weird, was that if I consider the wire to be at rest and the magnet to be moving, then Maxwell's equations tell me that the changing magnetic field, because of the motion of the magnet, creates an electric field in the vicinity of the wire and pointing kind of along the wire. And that electric field then pushes electrons around, which creates the current, right? But there's an electric field there, and that electric field has an energy and all this stuff. On the other hand, he says, if I just hold the magnet and move the wire at the same rate in the opposite direction, according to the theory, now the magnetic field isn't changing. There's no electric field anywhere. And the reason there's a current, you're going to get the same current, but the reason is because of an electromotive force that's postulated to exist when a charged particle moves through a magnetic field. And there's no energy associated with that. There's no electric field at all. And Einstein says that's very strange, because the observable effect, the amount of current, is exactly the same whether it's the wire at rest and the magnet moving, or the magnet at rest and the wire moving. And for him, Einstein said, that doesn't sound right to me, right? I mean, one might say it sounds kind of weirdly conspiratorial that you have very different explanations of this phenomenon depending upon whether it's this one or it's that one. But for all you can tell, the outcome is the same. And so really what Einstein wanted was a theory which treated these two cases exactly the same in terms of the physics. And that's what he thought special relativity achieved, by in some sense saying, well, really, there's no separate electric and magnetic fields at all. There's this one object, we can call it the electromagnetic field. In different frames of reference, you express it differently in terms of what's the electric part and what's the magnetic part, but that's not in reality. In reality, all there is this single unified object. So that's you can see what he was really interested in was not an experiment that came out not the way you thought it would, or the way people talk about Michelson-Morley, but a very everyday experiment with a magnet and a coil of wire, and saying, gosh, the Maxwell's theory seems to treat this phenomenon quite differently in cases where I think it should be treated in exactly the same way, and my theory will do that. Now, that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is that in 1905, Einstein certainly did not think of special relativity as a postulate about space-time structure in the way we now think of it. That really was the contribution of Minkowski to look at Einstein's equations, which they're kind of clunky equations. If you go back and look at the paper, it's all written in coordinate dependent form and so on. It doesn't look nice. And Minkowski looked at that and said, oh, I see. What Einstein is really postulating is that space-time has a certain unusual structure, a very different structure than Newton or Maxwell assumed. That's the way we understand the theory now. And I think that's the right way to understand the theory. That makes everything come out much cleaner, because you say, well, as soon as I say the fundamental space-time structure is, say, Minkowski space-time, then I'm going to say the fundamental physics should only mention that, should only have in it the Minkowski structure. And then you end up sort of with this electromagnetic field stuff and so on, kind of dropping out automatically. And you can understand the theory as a theory of space-time geometry. Now, it then took 15 years for Einstein to come up with general relativity, and his deep insight there, the so-called equivalence principle, was exactly the insight that in certain cases, you could take something that had been thought of as a gravitational acceleration requiring a gravitational force, the way Newton would treat it, and say, no, nothing's being accelerated at all. What you have is rather that just the curvature of space-time. And again, a kind of deeply geometrical understanding that the fundamental posit of the theory is that space-time doesn't even have exactly the Minkowski structure. It has a kind of curved structure that would account for the orbits of the planets and would account for the advance of the perihelion of Mercury and so on. So there, and it was a struggle. I mean, it was definitely not, certainly in the 1905 paper, you will not find a presentation of special relativity of the kind of, in my opinion, clarity and sharpness of what's really being postulated as you have once you start thinking about this in terms of space-time geometry. But it took a long time even to develop the mathematical tools to express that clearly. There was a lot of work done in understanding Lorentzian metrics and things like that had to be done before you could even write down the general relativistic field equation. Is that again, well, I've lost track a little bit of what the question was, but I did.
Allow me no worries. Allow me to try to get us back on to the question, which I think is pertinent to where we ultimately want to go with this conversation. We started with a difference that you had with Bernardo-Kastrup's language, right? I'm not sure what word to use. Interpretation in that case, is that okay to use his interpretation of reality or interpretation of physics or physical findings?
I'm not sure why one's using, I would say he has a theory of the world. He's trying to produce a theory of the world in which, according to that theory, what fundamentally exists only are minds and their contents. That's standard classical garden variety idealism, as I say, that Berkeley held. All there are fundamentally are minds and their contents, and Leibniz held. That's, of course, in terms of that theory, you would then try to explain what you see, and I guess you could call that an interpretation. But
let's call it theory.
The bottom is a postulate, right? What lies at the bottom is a kind of, is a postulate, just as the pilot wave theory postulates there are these particles. The many worlds theory does not postulate there are these particles. Those theories don't talk about minds and their contents at all, right? It never comes up. It's like, well, here's, I'm doing physics. Here's what there exists physically. So obviously, they're not concerned to postulate that there are minds and what their contents are. So yeah, I would say the word interpretation just has, it covers too many different things and has been used in too many different ways to be a useful term now. One should be clear.
Okay, theory is fine. The theory is fine.
Yes,
so he has a theory, Bernardo has a theory, and there's many different theories. So the question is, and what I'd like to make progress, if possible, is, according to your perspective, is of the different theories, the many, many different theories about physics out there, how do we determine which ones are more correct or more valuable, etc.? And allow me to, before I ask the question, allow me to say where I'd like to go with this is, so Bernardo-Kastrup has a theory that he's trying to build. Einstein, of course, is very famous for having put together the theory of special relativity, general relativity, and there's many other theories. You are in the process of formulating a new mathematics would you characterize this also as theory building, or how would you describe this?
Sure. It's what I'm doing. I mean, there are two steps to this. In mathematical physics, what one uses is hopefully mathematics, sharp mathematics, in order to formulate physical theories, right? And it's because you're using sharp mathematics that you don't get into a mess with these vague terms like measurement or observation or whatever. And you're really looking, can I write down sharp equations for the things that I'm postulating? Now, what I'm doing has two steps. One is a purely mathematical one, or as it were, a purely abstract one. You might call it abstract geometry. What kind of geometrical structure could be described mathematically? In particular, I'm interested in discrete geometries rather than continuous, so that for, say, a given point, there's literally the nearest neighbor points, right? In a continuum, given a point, there's no nearest neighbor because any other one you choose, you can find one closer. So if we have a discrete, what kind of discrete geometries could be just described purely as a piece of mathematics? And I am developing what I believe to be a unique or a new way of doing that. So it's kind of a new entry to here's a geometrical structure that could exist. And then once you have that, then you say, all right, let me see what would happen if I tried to write down physical laws or physical theories on the basis of the postulate that that is the structure of physical space or physical space-time. And then make predictions from that theory and see, basically, would it predict what we see? If it does, then it's a candidate, right? Then you'd say, well, at least as far as the experiments go, this could be the way things are. Now, you started off with the question, all right, once I have alternatives, like the many worlds approach to quantum mechanics is an alternative, is a different theory than the pilot wave approach, which are both different.
Discrete mathematics is another
which are both, different from the objective collapse approach. Discrete space-time, to say that space-time is fundamentally discrete is a different theory than saying it's fundamentally continuous. I mean, they both can't be correct, right? I mean, if it's continuous, it's not discrete, and if it's discrete, it's not continuous. Then you're faced with the question, well, why should I, how much credence should I give to any of these? If I have ones that are all okay with the experimental results,
that's the $1 million question. That's the $1 million question.
And it's not algorithmic, and there's not a magic, wand you can wave over it. What happens is different people will, all you can do is state your opinion and the grounds for it clearly. So here's a grounds many people have. Some people will say, well, by Occam's razor, I always prefer a theory that postulates less than another theory. And the many worlds people, the Everettians, will often say that, and they'll say, well, look, the pilot wave theory postulates both a quantum state and these particles. I only have a quantum state, okay? Well, less is more, right? Less wins. Or by Occam's razor, you should prefer a theory with less. So that's why I like this theory. Now, I think that principle, if you state it that way, is, again, it's very hard to defend. Because in other cases, it's absolutely not the case that we prefer theories with less, right?
Sure.
So, but what can you do? You kind of try and articulate your grounds for thinking one approach is more plausible or more credible than another. And it's not as if there's some, holy writ or fundamental principle that you can algorithmically apply to make that decision. And you don't want to. You want to have some people who are investigating this way of doing things, and other people who are investigating this way, and other people who are investigating this way, and usually following their own subjective view about what seems more plausible to them. All that's fine. You should just, the virtue is to state clearly what you're doing and why you yourself find it a plausible thing to do, so other people can understand. And I'm not trying to say there's a unique way to make these plausibility judgments. I don't think there is, but you should at least make them out in the open and try and explain why you think this is the right way to go.
Fantastic. I couldn't agree more. Very, very good. Very good. So allow me to try to ground this again and try to get to where we want to go. You are investing a lot of work in discrete geometry. You've been nice enough to give us a presentation on it. I'll put a link to that in the video description for the audience in case they have not seen it. And you're also working on the John Bell Institute. I'm assuming that it's all connected. All of this, your desire to found the institute, to promote the foundations of physics, your own research in the foundations of physics. Can you explain to us, or can you tell us what is the argument for? Start with the John Bell Institute, or with your argument for why the discrete geometry is a better approach to
I mean
progress in physics.
I mean the discrete geometry thing is just an instance, right? It's just an illustrative instance of what work in the foundations of physics is like. That is, you're considering various different alternative fundamental claims about the structure of physical reality. So this is just an instance. Fundamental claim, space-time, whatever it is a continuum. Different fundamental claim, space-time, whatever it is discrete. Okay, now you then have to fill in, all right, continuous in what way, discrete in what way? There are lots of ways to play out those things, and they would be different from each other. But certainly you have a basic dispute there, right? Now, this is a foundational question because everything you do in physics is set in space-time. And so the fundamental structure of space-time will have ramifications for everything else. And it's foundational in a way that, say, someone who has a certain theory about, I don't know, condensed matter, you might say, well, that's very interesting, but it's not going to have any application when I look at stars and there's no condensed matter in the star because it's too hot, right? Whatever you're doing, it's a little more parochial than looking at space-time structure, looking at, what is a quantum state, because everything seems to involve quantum mechanics in some way. So that's all I mean by foundations of physics. Now, the problem is, you would look at that and you say, well, why isn't that just physics? And the answer is, it is just physics, but it turns out people asking questions about fundamentally what should we make of quantum mechanical effects, or how should we approach quantum mechanical formalism and so on. Physics departments don't tend to like people who do that as their main calling. That for various historical reasons, foundational research in physics of this kind isn't considered to be an acceptable specialization in a physics department. And then correspondingly, a lot of people who do this, some of them like David Albert, end up in philosophy departments. David Wallace got first a degree in physics, was interested in these questions, realized he couldn't get a job in a physics department, so got a second PhD in philosophy and has a job in a philosophy department. So these are people kind of driven out of physics because they're interested in foundational questions, right?
May I pause here for a moment and mention one exception? Notable exception is Yakir Aharanov talks about his own trajectory, his career, and fighting off that impulse to not study the foundations, and he was able, of course, to make a very astounding carear.
Absolutely, and of course, Aharonov's teacher was Bohm. This was what Bohm was interested in, and Bell, of course, was interested in it, but only on Sundays, as he says. He had a kind of serious job at CERN during the week, not doing this, and then he was interested in it and he pursued it better than anybody else, more or less in his spare time. But sure, Aharonov, I don't want to say there are no people in physics departments who are interested in this, but
As a
if you
general
just
principle
went
or
to
not, yes.
if you just looked at job listings, I don't think you'll find job listings in physics departments. We're looking for a specialist in foundations of physics. You will find job listings in philosophy departments. We're looking for a specialist in philosophy of physics. And that's why often this field is called philosophy of physics, which to me is quite misleading because it's not really philosophy in the normal sense. I mean, that suggests you're doing something other than physics. And if you say you're doing foundations of physics, it's clear you are doing physics. You're just doing it at a foundational level. But sure, there are people in physics now. Aharonov is, I think one would have to say, the exception rather than the rule.
Yeah, definitely.
He made a wonderful career. I mean, Bohm. It's very hard to say what would have happened with David Bohm if this other political considerations hadn't gotten him basically thrown out of the country and he was, put in a complete mess. But for the most part, it's just, it's just objectively harder to make a career in a physics department if this is your primary interest that you want to work on than it is, oddly enough, in a philosophy department, or even in a math department as a mathematical physicist. The mathematicians seem to be more tolerant of people whose fundamental interest is in these foundational issues than you often find in physics departments. I think that's just a fact. It's that fact that motivated me to want to found this institute devoted to foundations of physics, just to sort of plant a flag and say, look, there's an actual topic here, right? There's a subject matter, and it's hard, and it's serious, and there are people who really care about it, and they have a real tough time. I mean, in general, certainly on the physics side of things, they have a very hard time. I like to tell their story. There's a story that I think Gell-Mann tells in his biography, where he says there was a colleague, I can't remember exactly who, I don't know if he names it, who had a very, very promising graduate student, right? Really impressed people. And after a few years, he sees his colleague and he says, oh, whatever happened to so-and-so, right? This graduate student? And he says, the guy shook his head and he said, no, he got lost. He tried to understand quantum mechanics.
Oh boy.
And that's Gell-Mann saying what the situation is. If and they warn you, don't try to understand quantum mechanics. You'll get sucked down some black hole and you'll never do physics again because you're actually trying to understand what you're doing. That's what gives rise to shut up and calculate, because if you don't shut up and calculate, you might get taken in by these questions that are going to derail your whole career.
Yeah, it's actually hard to believe that can be the case. Would you agree that the tide seems to be turning and there's more momentum for these kinds of questions? More,
I think the tide certainly is turning. I mean, there are many data points you could point to. One was this Nobel Prize given, that should have been given to John Bell, but it's of course after he died, so they couldn't. But at least they gave it to Aspey and Zeilinger and Clauser for experimental confirmation of violations of Bell's inequality, largely, although other things having to do with entanglement. That was a good sign. That they gave it to Roger Penrose, who was really also very much interested in these kinds of foundational issues. Again, very late in his career, you think. That was a good sign. I had, out of the blue, the chair of a physics department in England sent me an email about a year ago and said, we're thinking of starting to have a course in foundations of physics as part of our physics curriculum. Can you give me some advice about what books might be useful? And that was great. That's wonderful.
Yeah.
So I think there are a lot of data points. I think there's this sense that string theory has kind of collapsed as a promising way to think about a theory of everything, that it was going to somehow solve everything and unite quantum mechanics and gravity and everything else. I think, you know, even the string theorists now have pretty much abandoned that. And I think that has left people more willing to start asking themselves, well, what else can we do, right? I mean, we know we're not done. We don't have a good theory that puts together quantum phenomena and gravitational phenomena. For almost half a century, this string theory was touted as the only game in town to do this, and now it seems like it's not going to do that. And I think that makes people more open-minded. And I think as soon as you start asking questions like, well, what can we do at this point? How do we go forward? You realize that you haven't been trained to think about what in the foundational picture that I have could I tweak, could I change, could I alter that might open up new possibilities. And that is foundations of physics. So I think there's, you know, also just out of sheer desperation, you might say, some people might say, well, you know, these people working in foundations, maybe we should listen to them for a minute about what they, you know, what they think might be going on here, because we're a little lost.
I think that's more and more inevitable. Foundations, what can be more, I've argued for several years now, what could be more important than the foundations of physics? We live in a physical world. These are fundamentally important questions.
It is, although one does need to point out, I agree with you 100%. It's what could be more important if you're fundamentally motivated by curiosity about the world. It's a very, you might say, it's a very pure motivation. It's not saying, how do we continue to put more diodes on a chip, or how do we, you know, have technological advances at this point? Because I think the work has gone, you know, the standard model works perfectly well for all practical purposes. General relativity works perfectly well for all practical purposes, like GPS. So when you say it's the most important thing, I agree with you, but it's at least worth pointing out that the people who think that are not thinking in kind of gross material terms. They're just thinking, I just want to understand the world. I want to understand it at the level of physics.
Sure. I would say that it's really important on many different levels. Allow me to say very quickly, we're not here to talk about my stuff or my ideas, but I wrote my doctoral thesis on the physical and mathematical foundations of management. And one of my arguments is that we can't understand ourselves or anything about this world until we understand the foundations of physics. That's like, it's foundational. It's like trying to start a skyscraper from the top. And you've really got to start at the foundations and understand, what is this that we're living in? What are the rules? Once you understand those rules, I argue, then you can proceed and to build more solid theories of everything else, management, politics, etc. As a matter of fact, we're collaborating with a couple of Israeli physicists that you know, and so we're working with Aharanov and his work, and trying to connect those theories, his ideas to various other disciplines, working with, you know, top thinkers in many different branches, and it looks promising. So, but once again, I return to the foundations. I think this is fundamentally important. Look at the confusion that we're in as a species.
Well, look, of course, there's. So I'm gonna be impolite and push back a little on some of what you said. I mean, one thing that's absolutely clear is there is a general lack across the board of clear thinking. And we're in a hell of a mess because of that in all sorts of topics, right? That people can't say, look, here are my fundamental postulates. Here's what I think follows from what, you know, this is my reasons for believing this. People are very bad at that. And that's gotten us into a horrible mess. Whether foundational questions in physics, answering those would percolate up to all sorts of other things. Let me give you an example where I would doubt that. So just take geology. So for a long time, it was hard to understand the geological structure of the Earth, and then eventually you had this theory of plate tectonics that really, you had to understand that there were these very large plates that kind of float at very low speed along the Earth, and they bang into each other sometimes and form mountains, and they pull apart, and you get volcanoes and things like that. That was a very controversial theory when it was first proposed, the theory of plate tectonics. And it turns out to be right. And it makes a whole lot about the geology of the Earth comprehensible. I don't think that theory will be affected at all by resolving, if we eventually resolve these foundational questions in physics, because already the fundamental concepts are at kind of a very high level, and of rocks and big plates and floating and things like that no matter how the underlying physics comes out, though, that conceptual structure will remain and continue to be explanatory. Now, often people look at the foundations of physics and then they try to apply it kind of metaphorically, as if because something's going on in physics, it gives us a kind of image of other things. And that's a tricky business too. So I'm not sure that resolving foundational questions of physics will percolate up. Think about the Higgs particle. They finally actually found the Higgs particle at CERN. Aside from certain questions in theoretical physics, I don't think the existence of the Higgs particle is going to change management theory, right? It's not going to change plate tectonics. It's not going to change, the helical structure of DNA or things like that. So not every result in foundations of physics, even though it is in a certain sense foundational, will create a change at other levels of explanation that we're used to using.
Well, your skepticism is certainly understandable and well-founded. This is not the place or the time to really get into the details, but suffice it to say that the argument has been interesting enough for some top level thinkers in many different branches, from MIT and Harvard to Israel and London School of Economics, etc. So, and what we're proposing is empirical in nature. It's not opinion related, so it's empirical in nature.
That's good.
And I think it doesn't. Philosophy is fine as an opinion, but we're not philosophers. We're empiricists, and what we're proposing is empirical. And along those lines, what do you think about, of all the different approaches, if one of them, again, your skepticism is completely well-founded, but if one of the different theories about, say, just discrete geometry or the many worlds, if one of them gives us an open door or insights, even if they're metaphorical, if they give us insights into how to better run a city or a country or the planet, would you agree that it's a more attractive or a more useful approach to physics than one that has nothing to say about these kinds of things, like the many worlds?
Well, so let's leave many worlds aside. Many worlds, because it would be such a radical revision of everything. I mean, even plate tectonics, because many worlds would say, no, there are all these different plates and they're all, all moving. Everything would be affected by many worlds. Let's leave that one aside for a moment.
Okay.
I guess I want to say, I actually think, and I've had this discussion several times, I think there's a danger here, and one ought to recognize the danger. So if you take someone like Bohm, he talked a lot about the implicate order and undivided holism of the universe, which came out of thinking about quantum mechanics and came out of thinking about the quantum state, which seems to be holistic in a way that classical physics does not have. That, Maxwellian electrodynamics doesn't have, Newton's theory doesn't have this kind of undivided holism of the world. That's fine as physical observation. But many people, Bohm certainly included, and other people I know, have tried to go further. And they've said, well, this kind of unification or undivided holism or entanglement from quantum mechanics tells us we're all connected to each other, and then they try to base some moral observations on this, right? We should care about each other. We are all part of one seamless whole. And you can see how it's very easy to use that as a kind of metaphor for caring about everybody, being concerned about everybody, nice humanitarian goals. But what I like to point out is if you're a humanitarian like that, if tomorrow it turns out quantum mechanics is wrong, if it turns out that, Newton was more right, you don't want to say, oh, well, let's just kill each other then, right? So much for that, right? Why should I care about other people? There's no quantum entanglement.
Of course.
You would say, no, you wouldn't want to draw that consequence, right? You don't want your ethics to be hostage to your physics. People are very tempted to use the physics to illustrate the ethical principles. And as a kind of metaphor, it's okay pedagogically, but if you make that connection too tight, you're going to be stuck saying that, a revolution in physics could all of a sudden make all kinds of, consequences to our humanitarian goals. And you don't want to be in that position. So that's why I always urge caution. You could say it's sort of, it could be nice that people thinking about entanglement and so on as a side effect come to care more about their neighbors. But gee, it would be much better if they just cared more about their neighbors. Mm-hmm. If they care more about their neighbors because they understand their neighbors are human beings and they have value and their tribulations are, moral evils, and we should try to help. Insofar as we can, we should try to help people. I would prefer to keep my ethics founded on ethical considerations that float free a bit of physics.
Well, then you're positing two different worlds there, an ethical world and a physical world. And
I do. I'm what's called a Platonist about mathematics, which is, I think they're mathematical truths that are not physics. And I'm also a Platonist about certain parts of ethics. I think there are ethical principles that are not. I don't think you could change ethical principles by changing physical principles. I don't even understand how that could possibly work. Ethics seems to be a different subject matter, and principles of ethics do not have principles of physics tacitly underlying them, as far as I can tell. I couldn't even quite understand how they could.
Yeah, well, definitely I've read some of these, just skimmed some of these ideas about everybody being united and we're all one and we should be happy hippies and love each other. And that seems completely unrealistic and wacky, to be honest. No, we're not positing anything like that. We're actually getting down to very specific voting theories and using artificial intelligence to make real progress in open questions in voting theory and social choice theory and economics. So,
well, Arrow's theorem is a theorem. It's an important one, and it forces you to think about different voting ways you can vote and the effects that they'll have in terms of actually representing what the populace wants. I 100% agree with that. But absolutely. I can't think changes in foundations of physics is going to change that situation, right? I mean, Arrow's theorem is a theorem about voting procedures, not about the physics you use to implement them.
Sure, but Arrow's theorem is a mathematical theorem. And the idea is that the mathematics from different different physical formalisms can and we believe will inform how we approach resolving Arrow's impossibility theorem. That's the central idea.
That's quite ambitious.
Yeah, it's very ambitious. Definitely ambitious. But let's get back on track. And you're talking about the foundations of physics, your approach to discrete geometry, and the John Bell Institute. Tell us about where you are now with that, the people involved. Anything that you'd like to tell us about that? We're all ears. We're definitely open to
Yeah,
that.
I mean, look, there are two things to say about the Institute. The first thing to say is that what it is fundamentally is just a group of people with interests in foundations of physics and who are willing to talk, who are willing to talk to people, again, and listen, people from other disciplines. I mean, what I often say is that to do foundations of physics well, of course, you have to know physics, you have to know mathematics, some parts of it, and you have to have a philosophical temperament that cares about precision of meaning, precision of expression, exactly what follows from what. So foundations of physics gets contributions from the physics side, from the math side, from the philosophy side. And I think you have to do all three to a pretty decent level to do any of it very well. But that means you should be willing to sit and listen to people from other disciplines. I mean, I've learned a tremendous amount of physics. I've learned a tremendous from physicists, a tremendous amount of mathematics from mathematicians that I needed to know to be able to do this well. And I like to think that we have physicists who've learned some philosophical method and, mathematicians who've learned, that everybody learns from everybody else. But in order to do that, you have to have the right people and you have to give them the right opportunity. And by the right opportunity, I mean, the standard way that academic conferences are run does not promote this, because if you go to a conference and there are 8 talks in a row and each talk is half an hour with 15 minutes of discussion in a big audience, nothing for these kinds of topics, that won't do anything. It won't really have any good effect, because you can't settle these issues. You can't even make a position clear in 30 minutes, and you certainly can't answer all the questions that might come up and give all the relevant background and so on. You need a lot more time and a lot more freedom and a lot more openness to have conversations on this topic that are useful. And I would say the main point of the Institute is to gather together people who can do this, who are interested in doing this, so they can have workshops, so they can run summer schools, so they can introduce these topics to graduate students who typically don't have any real entree into the field because it's not taught in physics departments. So that's the main thing. Now, the secondary issue is, how do you promote that? And
allow me to pause. That is a very compelling argument. And the nice thing is that you're founding it or you have it now in Croatia, based in Croatia. So the fact that it's in Europe, I think we should talk offline and somehow to get that argument before the European Commission, because I think they're receptive to that. And I'd be very, very happy to help push that forward, because it's a solid argument, it's necessary, and a lot of people are looking for this kind of thing.
Yeah,
So
I'll just say a second about the practical situation. There probably, I think people in the EU and some of the European structures would be interested in this. It turns out, typically, what we need to do right now is find a place. What I want to do is find a place to build an institute devoted to this. So, lecture rooms and places for people to stay. So if you want to put on a conference, you want to put on a summer school, there's a place devoted to this sort of thing. Most funding institutions will not provide money to actually buy a piece of property. They will provide money to improve a piece of property that you already own, but they will not, you just cannot apply for funds to acquire property. So what I've been doing the last few years is trying to find a place, get a place so that something can be built there. And right now, and this is just very recent because of problems that have arisen, it looks like our best opportunity will be, we have a kind of informal, I mean, a written but not very detailed agreement with the University of Split, that we may be able to partner with the University of Split, and they may already have some property. In which case, if we can get that devoted to this, we can then apply for funding to refurbish or build what we need. So that's where we are right now. I mean, I've been trying to raise money through this GoFundMe for one property. It looks like that property can't work for various technical problems that have come up when we've looked at the precise legal standing of the property, which I only found out this week. So now it's I'm trying to, but the last time I had discussions with the University of Split, they actually said, look, we have a couple places that we have not developed yet, but we own, the location. So if we can complete an agreement with them, then it looks like there's a way to go forward. So that's where I am right now. But it looks like it's going to be longer than I had hoped to get something permanent. And this is hoping it can work out.
Well, I will definitely put the link to your GoFundMe page in the video description, and encourage listeners to contribute if they can. Fantastic. Now, last question, and hopefully we can cover some good ground here. Can you summarize what is your conception of or what a good physical theory requires, and how discrete geometry will fulfill those requirements?
Sure. So I think of any physical theory as having sort of three main components to it. First of all, you need a space-time structure. You need your physics goes on in space and time, and you need to be clear about the structure of space and time that you're postulating. I mean, if you read Newton's scholium on space and time that follows definition 8 in the Principia, he exactly does it. He says, well, I'm talking about space and time and motion. I'm going to give you a lot of detail about what I'm postulating about the structure of space and time and why I'm postulating it. Some of it is empirical. So he was very clear about that. So that's one element. And there are different possibilities here. Newton postulated a certain space-time structure. Special relativity postulates a different one. General relativity postulates yet a somewhat different one. What I'm doing will postulate yet a different one, different from all of those. Then you need to put something in the space-time. And there's no real point in postulating space-time without populating it with what John Bell called local beables, that is, things that exist at regions, at particular places in space-time. So you can talk about their configurations. You can say, oh, these particles or whatever more or less have the form of a cat. These particles more or less form a table and things like that. So you need a space-time structure. You need some local beables. And then you need whatever else you need. That is, you might postulate new things. Why? In service of explaining the behavior of the local beables in space-time. Because what our empirical data gives us is how stuff moved. Did a needle go this way or that way? Did a bunch of spots formed on a screen? Did they formed with these bands? And when I twiddled this dial, the bands shifted. I mean, things like that. All of that behavior, and this is what Bell insists on, and he has a very nice paper called The Theory of Local Beables about this. All of that behavior is fundamentally about how some localized stuff moves in space and time. And the rest of physics is postulating additional things in the service of explaining that behavior, maybe novel things. So when Maxwell introduces the electric and magnetic fields, those are local things, but they were completely novel. What's a field, right? I mean, they were used to talking about particles. What's a field? It's somehow spread out over all of space, and I need some equations and so on. And you say, but at the end of the day, why was he postulating that? Well, it's because of the behavior of matter, because of electricity and how electrons were moving, and how charged particles would jump from here to there and so on. So I think of that as being the sort of three steps, right? Give me a space-time, give me some stuff local in that space-time, and then give me whatever else you want to give me to fill out your story. And laws that are stated in terms of the space-time structure and tell you how this other stuff behaves. And then I can compare the predictions of your theory to what I see in the lab. That I would say at a very high level is how I understand physics. Now, there's some people who want to say, well, I'm not going to give you that. I'm not going to start with a space-time structure at all. I want that to somehow emerge later on in the game, right, out of something else. And quite honestly, I don't even understand how that can work. I've never seen it work. I've never understood how it could work. If the thing you start with just isn't set in any space-time setting at all, I don't even have a picture in my head of what it would mean to say space-time emerges. I understand how you could, and this is what I'm doing, I'm setting things in a discrete space-time and showing that relativistic structure emerges in the sense of something very nearly approximately relativistic shows up later on, right? That's fine, but I'm starting with something spatiotemporal, and then what emerges is also spatiotemporal. What if somebody says, I'm going to start with something with no space-time at all, or I don't know, in an infinite dimensional space-time, which some of these people will do. I just don't know how you get from there to here, right? I don't know how you start from that beginning and then end up with a picture of me waving my hands around in front of the camera. So I would say at the highest level, that's what I think physics ought to be. Now, you can have all kinds of disputes. You can have disputes about what the space-time structure is. You can have disputes about what's local in the space-time structure. You can have disputes about what else there is, like quantum states or wave functions, which are not local in the space-time structure. What you want to see is in a given theory how all these things fit together, right? You ought to only be postulating things for a reason because they're playing some fundamental role at the end of the day in generating these observable motions. So is that, I mean, that's the big picture.
That's the big picture. And what is the advantage that discrete geometry will bring to
Okay,
this?
so let me mention two.
Okay.
One advantage is very simple. It's a mathematical advantage. Everybody who looks into this knows that when you get to quantum field theory, standard quantum field theory, and you start to do calculations, try to do calculations, the calculations often blow up. They go singular. You get out infinities as your answers. Feynman's very clear about it. He says, this just makes no sense. Then they have to go through all kinds of tricks called renormalization theory to somehow extract finite answers from equations that seem to be giving me infinities by, sort of subtracting one infinity from another. But that's, it's strictly speaking, that makes no mathematical sense. Feynman was very dissatisfied with that procedure. If you start with a discrete structure, and often you get these infinities exactly because in a continuum, two things can get as close as you like. No matter how close they are, they can get closer. So if I imagine two charged particles, and I think there's an electric force between them that goes as the, 1 over r squared of the distance between them, as r can get as close to 0 as you like, and then that field will increase without bound. And then eventually the whole thing breaks down. And the self field, the field at the point of the particle is infinite. And then you can't make any sense out of it. So that's just a mathematical problem. Now, if you deal in a discrete space-time, that won't happen because things can't continually get closer without limit. I mean, you have a point, and there's literally the neighboring points, the ones that are as close as you can get.
So what does that imply for Coulomb's law, for example?
It implies that at very, very, very small scales, it would break down. That what you want is for Coulomb's law, something like Coulomb's law, to emerge at large scale.
Okay.
And if you imagine this discreteness is at some very small scale, I mean, people always talk about Planck length. I don't think for very good reasons, but if we took that, I don't know, 10 to the minus 42 centimeters, if you said, well, you know, even as soon as I get up to, you know, a billionth of a centimeter, something that looks like Coulomb's law will come out of this. In just the way, I mean, everybody understands this. Your computer screen is a discrete object. It has a finite number of pixels. There are so many that it can create images that pretty much look continuous, right? You'd say, oh, look, that's a circle, right? But it's trivial to see, okay, yeah, until you look too close, it's understandable why kind of Euclidean geometry and so on, if you applied it to your computer screen and your circles were large enough, kind of something close to Euclidean geometry will be okay. But once you get way down, right down to the basic elements, it's going to break down. So sure, you want you need to explain why equations stated in terms of a continuum work as well as they do where they work. And they certainly work very well over a wide range of scales. But to say that space-time is discrete at a very, very, very tiny scale is easily compatible with that. But it does avoid this breakdown that you get when you push, and things go singular, right? Because all you're ever doing is adding or subtracting a finite number of finite quantities, and that can't go infinite. You'll always get an answer. So that's one advantage to making things discrete. Another advantage is, and it sounds odd, if you do it and you do it the way I do it, you kind of can't avoid there being what we call the preferred foliation in space-time. So, you know, what's going to emerge is something that looks, again, at large scale, pretty much like a relativistic space-time with a light cone structure and so on. But what relativity does not have is a slicing of that into, as it were, equal time or absolute simultaneity, what Newton would call absolute simultaneity, a slicing up of this space-time horizontally, if you will. And that's perfectly understandable because for Einstein's purposes, he didn't need it. He didn't need it to do Maxwellian electrodynamics, and he didn't need it to provide a theory of gravity. And neither Maxwellian electrodynamics nor Newtonian gravity could violate Bell's inequality for distant systems. They just can't do it. What we now know is that nature does it, right? We know that in fact, Bell's inequality is violated for experiments done far away. We need the physics to be able to predict and explain that. The easiest way, for sure, is to put in one of these preferred foliations, right? To go back, as it were. It looks like it's going back to Newton. It isn't really, but in this respect, it is. To go back to the idea that there's a, as it were, a preferred slicing of this space-time that you can use when you write down the fundamental equations. And if you do it, the discrete geometry in the way I do it, you get that. You can't avoid it. It's there from the beginning. You don't add it. It's not thrown on top of something else. It's just already there, kind of unavoidably from the fundamental nature of the approach. So I think that's good, right? I think that's an advantage. It's saying, yeah, the space-time really does have built into it at its most basic level exactly the structure we need to explain this observable physical phenomenon.
For the sake of clarity in listeners, can you explain again the idea of the preferred foliation and how discrete geometry gets you there?
Yeah, I mean, let me first explain what. So what we know is that the violations of Bell's inequality. I've got Alice over here and Bob over here doing experiments in their labs, and what Bell showed was that if you think that something comes into Alice's lab and she does an experiment on it, and the results only depend on what's in her lab, and something comes into Bob's lab and he does an experiment on it, and his results only depend on what's in his lab. So Alice's lab is isolated, is causally isolated from the experiment Bob decides to do, and vice versa. What Bell showed is that under those circumstances, there are certain correlations between these results you cannot get. That's given by Bell's inequality. He says, if in a local theory like that Bob's experiment has no influence on Alice's outcome and Alice's experiment has no influence on Bob's outcome, there are certain constraints on the correlations you can possibly see. And those constraints are predicted to be violated by quantum mechanics, but most importantly, they are actually violated, right? That's what these experiments that Aspey and Zeilinger showed, doing it really fast enough, far enough apart, these two parts of the experiment, far enough apart and fast enough so that not even light could get from one to the other in time to have an influence. Okay. Now, what that suggests is that if something Alice is doing is going to influence Bob, or something Bob is doing is going to influence Alice, you want to know, well, who's going to influence who? And if the space-time has this foliation to it, if it's sliced up this way, then the obvious answer would be, well, the one who goes first affects the one who comes later, right? If Alice does her experiment first, then her experiment can affect Bob's outcome. And if Bob does his experiment first, then his experiment can affect Alice's outcome. And in standard relativity, there's just no fact about who goes first in this situation. So if the experiments are done at what's called space-like separation, which means that each is outside the other's light cone, then in relativity, you just can't say one came first and the other came second. There's no structure that would define that. And what a foliation, what a slicing this way would do is it would define that. It would say, well, relative to this slicing, Alice went first and Bob came later, or the other way around. There'll always be a fact about who did what when, as it were. Now, if you ask, why is this unavoidable in the kind of discrete space-time I'm dealing with, I would have to go into somewhat more detail about the postulates that I have. But maybe the right way to put it is this. Maybe this will help. In this theory, if I have a space-time, think of an event in space-time as a point. Each point will have nearest neighbors to it that are neither before it or after it. So I haven't put any time in yet, but it has its nearest neighbors, and those have nearest neighbors, and those have nearest neighbors, and so on. That structure gives me a kind of foliation. It's more or less because in this kind of discrete space-time, you can talk about who are the immediate neighbors of any geometrical element.
Sorry, how can you posit a space-time but not posit before and after?
Well, no, it's not a space-time yet. You start with discrete space. I'm just giving you the structure of the spatial part.
I see.
And then when I put time in, so if you have this picture, you have these discrete elements. When I put time in, what I do is I put directed arrows that indicate temporal precedence. So it's also the case
before and after.
that from this event, there are the nearest temporal neighbors that come later, right? It's a finite set of the next events that happen. And it works the same way, but the temporal arrows have they have arrows. They're directed, unlike the spatial ones that don't have any direction. The temporal ones do that, and that you can sort of see how that's going to give you something like a light cone structure. Because if you start at any event, you go to the temporally next ones, and then the temporally next ones, and so on. And that's actually going to give you a structure from which you can see it sort of looks like a light cone, and it's not so odd that you could see the standard light cone structure of relativity emerging out of this theory.
I see. So one, the infinities, one advantage, it gets rid of the infinities, and two is this, it gives rise to a light cone structure.
It gives rise to a light cone structure plus a foliation. You also have this horizontal thing that you're going to use to write down the laws of quantum mechanics. This is what I'm saying. Quantum mechanics seems to really need that. in a way that classical physics doesn't. And you'll have it available already from the beginning. You'll be able to write down your equations in terms of this foliation. And this is where all the fight comes in, because standard relativity doesn't have that foliation. So I am, in this obvious sense, simply rejecting standard relativity. I want something like standard relativity to emerge, but nonetheless, it has this underlying structure which relativity doesn't have. If you're too wedded to relativity, and it seems to me physicists are way too wedded to relativity, then they reject it immediately, right?
How would you get it to emerge from that? I suppose that would be the question.
How do I get what to emerge? The
standard relativity to emerge from your foliation.
So standard relativity is based, the way to think about it is that standard relativity is based on a quantity that's called the interval, the relativistic interval between events, the invariant interval. And in a very strict way, at least in certain cases, in 2 + 1 dimensional spacetime, I can really show you this. There is a quantity which has to do, so let me explain the quantity. It's a measure of path connectivity. What do I mean by that? Take any event and take any other event. Now, because this is a discrete structure, I can literally count how many discrete continuous paths connect this one to this one if I only go by the time arrows. So to get from this one to this one, I'm always going to follow these arrows, which are kind of pointing upward. And I might be able to wiggle this way and wiggle back, or wiggle this way and wiggle back, right? They're just going to be a finite number.
Okay, but did the arrows connect events, or did the arrows connect just 2 events or several events?
Well, they connect, what they do fundamentally is connect any event to the immediate successors, but then those have immediate successors and those do. So it's a directed graph. You can just follow the arrows through it, right? You just follow the chain. And there are different ways typically to get from here to here. Now, if the events are here and here, there are no chains that'll take you there because the arrows are kind of going up. So I can't follow any arrows to get from here to here. Those would be space-like separated. In standard relativity, light-like separated events, there's only one continuous path in time that gets you from here to here. And if they're time-like separated, there are many. And in this theory, you can do that and literally count the paths because it's finite. You can't really count them in relativity because there are really infinitely many paths. But in this theory, because it's discrete, you have counting measure, you can literally count the paths. And what you can show is that in certain of these structures, this quantity, path connectivity, which is just counting these paths, as the grid gets finer and finer, strictly approaches the structure of the invariant interval in special relativity.
Oh, wow, interesting.
Yeah, it really, and I wasn't expecting it. I mean, I started doing this stuff and I was just trying to figure out how could you do it? And I came up with this structure and then I just started running these numbers. And it just falls out that in 2 + 1 dimensional space-time with a certain structure, the relativistic structure seems to emerge perfectly. Surprised the hell out of me. I wasn't expecting.
Yeah, interesting. Well, tell us about this moment. When did it occur? In a lecture?
It happened this last summer, I think. If I'm going, this is all very recent.
Yeah.
I've been writing a book on this, and the first 6 chapters are just about spatial structure, because what you need to do is define this discrete spatial structure and then explain the discrete analogs to the usual operators you have in a continuum, like divergence and gradient and curl of a vector field and so on. So those are the mathematical terms in which the standard classical physics is stated. And what you want is a kind of way to say, oh, this, the divergence here goes over to this operator here, and the curl goes over to this operator and so on. So that was 6 chapters of this book. And only after 6 chapters, now what happens when we bring in time? Okay, so I've got these spatial structures, and now I'm sticking these arrows in to show the time relations and trying to do it in kind of the simplest way I can think of that isn't absolutely pointless. and trivial, and kind of right out of the gate, about the easiest thing I tried when I got to 2 + 1 dimensions, this relativistic structure just pops out.
Very cool.
I would
I
love to.
literally, I mean, I couldn't do this algebraically, so I'm using Wolfram's calculator to calculate these combinatoric numbers with, you know, that are, I mean, the standard number for the example I used is 3 point something times 10 to the 472. So these are big numbers, right? And I'm literally pressing the button and waiting for Wolfram to give me an answer. And it keeps coming back 3 and change times 10 to the 472, 3 and change times. I'm going, oh, wow, man, this is, and you're kind of making the predictions using relativity and then plugging in these things to calculate the discrete numbers, and they're just coming bang on. It was just amazing.
Well, if you're open to it, I'd love to get some, spur some conversation about this on the channel, if you're open to it.
Sure. I mean, I'm happy to do, I can present the whole thing. You know, I mean, I need to be able to show some pictures. You know, I can't just wave my hands. I mean, I need, you know, a little pedagogical aid, but it's all very basic and geometrical, and you're just counting. So it's actually, the conceptual foundations are absolutely trivial. And it's just a matter of seeing what the structure is and what I'm counting, and then I can show you how it comes out.
Well, excellent. I'm definitely interested in that. I'd like to get somebody who's a little bit more qualified to give you feedback. So if you have anybody in mind, I'm open to it. We'll get them on, and hopefully we can talk about it. If not, I'll ask some of the people I know. And
yeah, I'm not, you know, nobody pops into mind. I mean, there are very few people actually looking at this question of what could a discrete space-time look like. And especially doing what I'm doing, which is not approaching it with quantum mechanics in mind, but just approaching it with geometry in mind. So I you know, whenever I give this talk, people are quite intrigued by it, right? I mean, the feedback has been very positive, but it's largely like, wow, I didn't, you know, expect anything like that, because who's even thinking about it, right?
Okay, well, fantastic. Thank you very much for talking to us today. I sincerely appreciate it. I hope you're open to coming back again and talking some more about the implications of discrete geometry.
Sure.
And your argument for it.
Sometime we can get to the Aharnov-Bohm effect, which is also an effect that doesn't get enough attention, and people, you know, it's a very interesting effect, and people haven't thought deeply enough about what it's telling us. So you mentioned that early on, so, and I thought,
no, we agreed to talk about that. Unfortunately, we got a little bit derailed. Well, let's come back and talk about that. If you're open to it, I'm receptive. We'll just talk about the Aharnov-Bohm effect. And interesting, can you connect it to discrete geometry, or is that something that's still?
Yes, I can. Yes, I can.
You can.
And I actually, I can say 2 words for people who know this stuff.
Wow.
About the connection. So I think the right way to understand the effect is the way Aharnov and Bohm themselves said to understand it, which is it's telling us that the electric and magnetic fields are not fundamental physical entities, that you need to think in terms of the potentials, the scalar and vector potentials.
They're very explicit about that. The opening paragraph. Yeah.
And I think they're right. I think that's the right.
Wow, fantastic.
But
what a
then
shame we didn't get to today.
Then now I can say now the immediate response is people say, oh, but you can always do a gauge transformation and change what the vector and scalar potentials are. And so that's why people never took gauge seriously, because there's this gauge freedom to choose different gauges. Now, among those gauges, mostly people, when they do things, they choose what's called Lorentz gauge. But that doesn't even exactly fix the gauge. But there's another gauge they use sometimes called Coulomb gauge. And for anybody who knows this stuff, Coulomb gauge has instantaneous effects of the Coulomb, of the scalar potential. In other words, in Coulomb gauge, if I have two charged particles and I move this one a little closer to that one, there will be an effect of the scalar potential on this one instantaneously.
Non-local.
Yeah, non-local and instantaneous. So if you say, I want to think in terms of potentials and I want to choose Coulomb gauge, then you need a foliation.
Oh, very interesting.
Right? Because it's instantaneous. So I need a foliation to explain what I mean by instantaneous. Right? So we see the connection again.
Wow. Well, I have somebody. Having said that, I have somebody in mind. Definitely. I think you're going to be interested and cool. Very good. In fact, it's a mentee of Aharanov, so that would be interesting to talk between the three of us about that. Fantastic. Well, let's set it up. If you're open to it, I'll set it up. And fantastic. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to talk again today. I appreciate it.
Okay.